Welcome back to Sustainability Street, our podcast on the intersection of commercial real estate and the world we live in. I'm your host, Therese Fitzgerald. The scarcity of land for new industrial construction has brought a heightened focus to brownfield redevelopment. Increasing industrial rents justify the costs and risks associated with this endeavor. My guest, David Greek, managing partner of Greek Real Estate Partners, is no stranger to brownfield remediation. The third generation New Jersey developer says cleaning up and reactivating previously used and often contaminated sites is par for the course in his state, the country's fifth smallest and one with a long history of manufacturing. Greek and I discuss the prospects and challenges of transforming remnants of the past into real estate opportunities for the future. Here's our conversation. Hi, David. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
David, tell us a little bit about your company and how you came upon Brownfields as an opportunity.
So Greek Real Estate Partners has quite a long history. I'll compress it as much as I can. My grandfather started as a contractor in northern New Jersey in the 1930s, really starting with some small jobs around the neighborhood. First job was a $500 porch on the back of someone's house. He kept growing his business and eventually partnered with a large manufacturer up in northern Jersey, started buying some property and developing it for himself. My dad went to Georgia Tech and joined the military for about 4 years, then came back to New Jersey and joined up with his dad, moved the business down to East Brunswick, where we still are today, and really focused our business around industrial in the late 1960s. I joined about a little over a decade ago and have continued to grow and evolve the business. Since I've joined, we've taken on two really large projects. One of them actually one of the bigger brownfields in New Jersey, up in Linden, New Jersey. And we've grown our company quite a bit just due to the amount of activity that we've taken on over the last 10 years. Now, we're based in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the oldest industrial markets in the United States, if not the oldest. So almost all of our development sites here have some history, whether that's just farming, which is usually the cleanest, to some heavy industry, which is very common here. That history often comes with some historic contamination. Environmental laws in the United States really didn't get very strict until the 70s and 80s, and a lot of the industry that's been in New Jersey has been here well before that. So with the lack of availability of land here, we're the densest state in the nation. We basically don't have a choice but to develop on brownfield sites. And so we at Greek Real Estate Partners, as well as kind of the rest of the industrial development industry in New Jersey, has become pretty expert in taking sites that were very contaminated, unusable, and figuring a way to remediate the contamination on site so that we can redevelop them, bring them back to productivity, and make an economic gain for both the developer and for the local communities. So it's not by choice, it's more by necessity that we have become experts in this topic.
Interesting. And just back up a little bit, a brownfield investment versus a greenfield investment. How do you differentiate between the two?
Like I said, in New Jersey, there's very often not really a true greenfield investment. Even, I'll give you an example. Aside from Linden, which I'm sure we'll cover in a little bit more depth throughout the interview, Logan North Industrial Park was one of our other large investments over the last 10 years. That is located in southern New Jersey on historic farmland. And we bought it from a corporation that had been using the site basically as a buffer for a much dirtier use that was kind of located in the center of the site. That use was basically in the 70s and 80s, they were taking industrial waste and incinerating it on site. So a very, very dirty use surrounded by greenfield farmland. Despite the fact that it only had a history as farmland, the use in the center of the site had contaminated some of the groundwater in the site itself. So even for really, virgin farmland, we dealt with some level of remediation and brownfield documentation and cleanup on that site. So it's very rare for us to find any piece of land that is truly greenfield, meaning there's no real environmental history, nothing for us to do in terms of containing the contamination before starting. Now, there's different degrees of brownfield properties for sure. And I'd say the example I just gave is probably the easiest, the least complicated of the types of projects that we undertake. I say on the flip side of that, Linden Logistics Center is probably the opposite in terms of its complication and its history. So backing up a few steps before I go into a lot of detail about what Linden is. When we're looking at greenfield versus brownfield, really there's two major considerations that we think about in terms of the investment itself. And the first is time, right? Because time costs money, especially when you're developing land. And the time it takes to go through the regulatory procedures for remediation, as well as actually perform the physical work of remediation, it adds quite a bit of expense and time to a project. So we need to make sure that when we are purchasing that project, we're either paying the right price so that we can accommodate the amount of time we need, or creating a structure within that contract that either shares some liability between the seller and the buyer, or gives us the flexibility to continue down the remediation road no matter what the cost is. So there's a lot of structuring that goes on upfront in contracts or with brownfields, and that's in a lot of the ways how we protect ourselves against some of the risks associated with moving forward with that.
So in New Jersey, you said you don't really have a choice. If I was an investor in another state and I had a choice, why would I invest in a brownfield?
Oftentimes, brownfields have been sitting in some state of remediation for a long time. Remediation doesn't happen quickly in a lot of cases. It depends on the contaminants that you're cleaning up in terms of how quickly you can. But, to give you an example, some sites can be remediated in 6 to 8 months. Some sites may take 20 to 30 years. And because of the, kind of variability within the time and expense of remediating depending on what type of contamination was present at the site, this is complicated stuff. And it isn't for every investor for sure. So there's a whole universe of developers and investors out there that just simply will not touch contaminated sites because of the expertise and the risk that it takes to invest in these sites. So there's less competition typically, especially in markets outside of places like New Jersey, where almost all the developers here are kind of used to taking on that risk. So if you go down to the Southeast or the Midwest, you will be able to find some contaminated sites in really, really prime locations that might be something that we're pretty familiar with in New Jersey because we deal with contamination all the time, but might not be familiar to the local players in Memphis or Nashville or Oklahoma, for example, where there might be plenty of other kind of virgin greenfield sites in the surrounding communities. But if you're really looking for very, very prime real estate and you want to get it for a discount, seeking some contaminated sites is a great way of going about that. As long as you can kind of box the risk and understand the risk up front, structure that within your contract, or structure that within your purchase price, there can be a big advantage to taking on remediation, especially in areas where people are, less familiar, less comfortable with it.
And have you taken your expertise on the road? Are you in other markets?
We've typically stayed pretty close to our headquarters. One of the reasons is because we self-perform the contracting, we build our own projects. And so, historically, and we have a long history, we really wanted to be able to physically be at a site within 2 or 3 hours if something went wrong so that we could be very hands-on with our management. We kind of broke that rule maybe 6 or 7 years ago. A friend of mine called with a site out in Chicago that had some low level groundwater contamination as well as a few tidal issues. He was having trouble wrapping his head around it and figuring out how to de-risk the site so he could close and build an industrial building. He knew me as the Jersey guy, so he gave me a call to see if we could help. And we stepped in, brought some equity to the project, kind of untangled some of the title and the environmental issues, and then eventually built and still own that project. So that's a great example of an area where, in actuality, the solution to the environmental issue was, in our world, relatively straightforward. But to a developer based out of the Midwest, it was very new territory for him, and he was very nervous taking on that without the experience and resume behind him to do it. So that's a great example of where we got a very prime infill location at a good basis simply because we understood the risk and were able to solve for it.
So the term brownfield has been around a long time. What's driving the trend currently?
Oh, a few things. The most important, I'd say, is simply the value of industrial real estate. And that, directly hinges on growing rents within the industry. So we've seen a huge spike in demand over the last 10 years for a lot of different reasons, ranging from just the general adaptation of e-commerce to some of the issues with supply chain that occurred during COVID. Really has created a lot of demand for new distribution space across the United States. But when you have a land constrained market like New Jersey, California is another good example of this. Some of those costs and time constraints that I talked about that make developing impacted sites harder, those higher rents and the higher residual values for the real estate help justify taking on that risk and that expense. So I can use Linden again as an example of this, right? Because when we bought Linden, it was around 2017, 2018. We were just kind of scratching the rent levels we would need in order to justify taking on the cost of the remediation of that site. Rents have since roughly doubled in that market. And so while the initial approach to the project was, we know we can do a little bit better than break even by remediating and building warehouses on this site, as the market grew and rents grew, that kind of break even analysis became much more lucrative for the investor and the developer. And that has helped unlock, so to speak, quite a bit of contaminated sites across the state. And that's what you see really across the United States. As rents have grown, as demand has grown, and kind of the obvious, easy pieces of land to develop have been taken off the board, you see developers focusing more and more on these infill, great locations that might be a little bit more expensive or time consuming upfront to remediate.
And just get the lay of the land. How many brownfield sites would you say there are nationally, and how many are in New Jersey?
A lot. I can't speak nationally. I know there's probably hundreds of thousands nationally. I believe the EPA estimates there's about 450,000. In New Jersey, we have close to 10,000 of those.
Wow.
A lot of those, have been remediated, or a lot of those are going through remediation. And additionally, that neither of those numbers actually captures the amount of contamination across the United States, right? Because those are really only sites that have been tested and identified. Every time we look at a piece of land, we go in and we test for contamination. So often we're discovering brownfield sites just through our land diligence. So I would say that, both those numbers are a vast underestimate of the amount of contamination that's present in soils and groundwater across the United States. But that's a good number to go off of.
Tell us more about what's going on in New Jersey with brownfields.
Well, New Jersey continues to be kind of the epicenter of brownfield redevelopment across the United States. We've undertaken quite a few projects. I've mentioned two, but over the last 10 years, there's a couple more that we have done. Let me start by actually going into a little bit more detail on the Linden Logistics Center, because I think that's kind of the PhD level of environmental remediation.
Okay.
I mentioned that this site's first operation was processing phosphates for fertilizer back in the 1890s. In the 1920s, this sold to a chemical dye manufacturer, which that dye manufacturer was eventually acquired by Dow DuPont. And on the rear of the site in the late 60s, early 70s, GAF came in and set up North America's largest roofing manufacturing operation on site. If you know anything about those two industries, especially their history, most people don't, but they're very, very dirty, particularly chemical dyes. The way that we used to dispose of those chemicals, and this was, the state regulated way to do it. You dug a hole in the ground, you filled it with gravel, and you poured those chemicals down the hole, and you never thought about them again. Well, today we have to think about them again because they are contaminating the soil, they're contaminating the groundwater. These are dangerous chemicals that are not good for human health. So Linden, when we acquired it, had been vacant for almost 20 years. The state and the federal government had shut it down due to the level of contamination on site. It was not a safe place to work. In its heyday, this was actually the largest employer in the town of Linden. It employed close to 6,000 people at its peak. It had gone to 0 employees, and that had really hurt the town. But there was very little the town could do about it because, the expense, the complication, the time it took to remediate it was too much. Thankfully, the responsible parties in this case are still very much around. And over the 20 years the site had been vacant, they had started to figure out how to remediate it. And remediating it had a lot of different components. The first and kind of the easiest to understand component was the site was in a floodplain. There's, major contaminated soils and groundwater there. So in order to make this buildable, as well as to kind of encapsulate some of the contamination, a lot of fill was imported to the site. Overall, the site was raised about 14 to 16 feet. Hundreds of thousands of tons of soil was brought in from all sorts of sources. The dredging of the harbor brought in quite a lot of dirt. Even some of the debris from 9/11 made it to this site. So really, they were taking on all sorts of different fill sources there. The other thing that was being done was, I'll use layman's terms for this because it's easier to understand that way. Basically, in order to make sure that groundwater that was contaminated on site stayed contained, an enormous underground bathtub was built. Basically, walls driven into the ground below the level of the groundwater and a pump system put in place so that it would keep the groundwater that was contaminated on site. An extremely large project, an extremely complicated engineering project. And that's another example of kind of, that is ongoing. Even when that was built and the pump system's installed, we need to continue to maintain it, to operate it so that the groundwater stays in place and doesn't contaminate the surrounding area. And finally, the last step to the remediation there, although like I said, it's still kind of ongoing, is our development itself. And what our development itself does is create a cap for all the contaminants on site. So a combination of the buildings themselves, the pavement we're putting down, the landscaping and topsoil that we put on top of this dirt, it actually acts as an encapsulation so that, that contaminated soil is not exposed to the public, exposed to the air, the elements, and cannot spread. And that's often, the secret sauce of industrial remediation is industrial development. These buildings have really big footprints. The truck courts have a lot of pavement. And while, some environmentalists would say that's not a good thing because it might help drive some flood water. It doesn't allow the groundwater to recharge. When your ground is really, really dirty, you don't want that happening, right? You want to keep those elements separated. So where, some other types of developments have a harder time kind of encapsulating the sites, industrial is almost tailor-made for it. So in Linden, once we have completed the building of the buildings, that's really the end of the remediation. All these steps taken over the course of 20 to 30 years kind of end with our development, and you get the benefit of kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone from the town's perspective. We've brought back thousands of jobs. We have now made this again the largest employment center in the town. And we have, taken what was a danger to the community and completely encapsulated it. So, from the town of Linden's perspective, this is all good things. They're producing new tax revenue, they're employing their people, they've removed a very public eyesore, and they've removed some environmental danger from their community. It's only a good thing for the community, and they're very excited that finally someone has come along and after 20, 30 years of this site being vacant, been able to figure it out and remediate to get it done.
That's a great story.
Thanks.
Now, there are government incentives for brownfield development.
There are statewide. New Jersey has what we call the Brownfield Remediation Program. It basically gives developers some credit for the amount of expense they put in up front. It kicks in later, so the developer spends the expense, and then after the remediation has been kind of tested and approved by the state, some of that expense can come back to the developer. It's a program that's been around for over 10 years. It's been pretty successful in terms of helping justify the expense. However, I'd say it kind of pales in comparison. Any government program kind of pales in comparison to the market to actually drive some of these things. So, while the Brownfields program in New Jersey has been around for a long time, a lot of uptick in the remediation activity only really occurred when the value of the underlying real estate justified it. So, these programs are good, and they can certainly help kickstart a few projects here and there that might not have made sense on the margin. But the best thing for, continuing this remediation and actually getting to some of those even harder, more difficult, more inaccessible sites would be to have the value in the rents in the industrial space continue to grow.
After a short break, how New Jersey has streamlined brownfield remediation.
Hi, this is Jessica Feuer, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Property Executive. I just wanted to make sure you know that the entries for this 2025 CPE Influence Awards are now open. We're ready to hear all about your most noteworthy properties, projects, and transactions. Does your office have unique design elements that attract tenants? Are you the top broker at your firm? Were you able to successfully reposition a property? We want to celebrate your successes. Email me at jessica.feuer@cpe-mhn.com and I'll guide you through the entire process. The entries are due June 6th, so you have plenty of time. Thank you.
So, David, how many brownfield projects do you have ongoing, or how many have you completed?
We have about 5 ongoing right now. As for the number we've completed, we've been developing since before Brownfields was a word, so I can't really speak through our entire history, but I'd say over the last 20, 30 years, probably about 20 sites we've remediated in some capacity.
Can you describe the process? Is there an approval process that you go through first before starting, and tell us how it goes?
Yeah, I'd say one of the best pieces of legislation that New Jersey has enacted over the last 20 years is directly related to this. So New Jersey passed a program called the Licensed Site Remediation Professional, which basically outsources some of the oversight of remediation to a private licensed remediation specialist. So before this law, kind of all of these processes ran through the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and that created quite a bottleneck in terms of getting projects approved for remediation. We as a state decided to, instead of staffing up at the DEP and trying to relieve that bottleneck through more government staff, create a license program that basically allowed private environmental professionals to get a license with the state to oversee and help developers come up with remediation plans. And this drastically sped up the process of coming up with ways to remediate sites and getting them approved. Ultimately, the holder of the license, the LSRP, is responsible to the DEP and really has their career on the line to make sure that the developer is doing things correctly and according to state guidelines. but you don't have the clunkiness of submitting paperwork and into, what was often a black box of a government agency and not really knowing who was reviewing or what questions they had. So we found the LSRP program to be a real game changer in terms of our comfort in approaching these sites, our ability to, kind of brainstorm what the most effective way, the quickest, the most economic way to remediate sites are. And certainly the actual oversight is much faster. You get feedback in real time instead of, weeks and weeks of delay. So that program has really, really helped kind of kickstart a lot of the remediation across the state. So, the basic process is different for every site. There's different types of contamination and different ways of cleaning it up. So I won't go into a ton of detail in terms of how we clean up particular environmental constituents. But basically, we come up with a plan called a remedial action plan with our LSRP. I'm sorry, this space is full of acronyms, so feel free to interrupt me if I say
Okay.
recognize. Once we come up with the remedial action plan, we go ahead and we undertake it, usually hiring a few specialty subcontractors that specialize in some of the remediation, depending on what type it is. It can range from something as simple as, I say simple, but it's not always simple, PCB spotting on concrete, and that can basically come from a leaking transformer or equipment within the space that leaks some contaminants onto concrete and stain that concrete and contaminated the concrete. And I say that's simple because often the remediation there is simply digging up and removing that concrete and disposing of it properly off-site. You'll actually find that's a pretty common remediation method. If you can physically pick up what's dirty and take it off-site to the appropriate place where it can be stored safely or cleaned up, that's often the cheapest method and certainly the fastest. But for things like groundwater contamination, for example, you can't exactly scoop up all the groundwater off your site and export it, right? Because water is just going to keep flowing in from other sites. So often, that type of contamination, along with a few other kinds, kind of needs to stay in place and be treated in place. So often you'll see ongoing remediation, particularly for groundwater, long after the project is built. You'll have pump stations pumping groundwater up from the ground and either treating it or testing it repeatedly to make sure that those contaminants aren't spreading, growing, or if there's some remediation involved, that they're actually declining over time. And the LSRP really oversees every aspect of this. So when you're done, and done often means finished the physical work, but oftentimes there's continued monitoring of the previous problem after you've, quote, solved it. So the LSRP will give you a remedial action outcome letter, which basically tells you that here's the scope of work you performed, here's when it was completed, and here's any ongoing obligations that you as the property owner have in terms of reporting or continued testing or whatever those ongoing obligations are. Often environmental is an ongoing concern for a property owner. It doesn't necessarily end when the development ends. And that, again, like as being part of the New Jersey market, that's not only something that almost all developers have to be comfortable with, but really almost all property owners in the state really need some level of environmental awareness, comfort with taking on some of these ongoing reporting requirements, testing requirements for these sites.
Can the owner of a remediated site be held liable if it turns out that the remediation was not successful? And how generally can owners minimize risk?
It's a really good question, one that we're constantly trying to solve for as well. So certainly, if we're undertaking remediation activities and we do something wrong, or we, God forbid, make the problem worse, and that could mean, for example, if you have contamination on your site and you spread it to a neighboring site somehow, that just made the problem a lot worse, right? So we never want to make the problem worse. But if we were to, yes, we absolutely could be held liable, both by the DEP and by private parties that we damage In addition, there's a concept of the responsible party, right? So the original cause of the contamination, whoever, whatever entity caused that contamination can also be held responsible. In a place like New Jersey, that can get very, very complicated, right? Because I'll give you an example. The first business in the Linden Logistics Center was in the 1890s. They were importing buffalo bones from out west and grinding them up and processing them into phosphate so they could sell it as fertilizer. That business has not existed for a very long time. I believe it went out of business in the 1910s. I couldn't tell you the name of the person that ran it or really anything about it. Now, luckily, that's a relatively clean operation, despite I'm sure it was actually quite messy at the time, but didn't leave any traces of contamination that we found there. So that's relatively, but if it had, right, and this is very common, there's no way to hold that company responsible for the environmental damage that they caused. So often that can cause, whoever is next in line to take on that responsibility. And the next in line is really the property owner. So if the person that caused the remediation sold to John Doe, and that corporation goes bankrupt and is no longer around, John Doe is now the responsible party according to the state. And this is some of the things I was talking about before in terms of structuring the contract up front to share liability. This is something I was specifically referring to. When we buy a contaminated property, certainly if the entity that caused that contamination is still around, we want to look to protect ourselves by, getting some sort of indemnity from the entity that caused the contamination. And usually we try and do that upfront in the contract. A lot of times we're buying these sites directly from the responsible party, so that makes it relatively easy. But in cases where we're not, we do a lot of research in terms of, whether that entity is still around, whether they're still a going concern. If they're not, then the preceding property owners, we have to do our diligence on them. And, if they bought the property knowing that there was environmental contamination and they have the financial wherewithal to indemnify us, we'll take that. But often they don't. And so, this kind of becomes a function of price. If we're taking on the responsible party liability here, that can be somewhat of a blank check and, a lot of unknown timelines. So that's, we kind of price these projects according to the amount of risk we're taking. If we're taking on that amount of risk, then we're simply, going to pay a lower price for the development.
How does the Trump presidency impact this form of investment? He's promises to be lighter on regulation and maybe offering more tax incentives. Does it create more opportunity for you?
Maybe. We'll see. Trump has certainly talked a little bit about the Environmental Protection Agency and kind of changing the way that it operates. But, we don't deal with the EPA that much when we're doing site remediation. Often, if not always, New Jersey's environmental guidelines are much stricter than the federal government's. So, if we comply with just federal guidelines, we are not doing our job here and we're not remediating the site to the level it needs to be remediated to be developed in New Jersey. So almost all of our interactions come through the state level. And I can say that's true in New Jersey, it's true in Pennsylvania, it's true in Delaware, it's true in almost all the markets that we develop in. We have and we are looking at a few Superfund sites, and Superfunds are kind of the next level of environmental contamination. Basically, when a site is too contaminated to clean up privately, or the responsible parties are nowhere to be found, the EPA kind of puts it in a special category and provides it with a little bit of special funding so that it can be remediated and kind of brought back to the state level, where the state can kind of finish up the more nuanced part of the remediation and building something on it. So I don't know what this administration's changing view of how the EPA works and how it's staffed and how it interacts with developers. I don't know how that's going to change. We do anticipate it is going to change. And if it changes in some of the ways that this administration is seeking, that may be a good thing. They are talking about doing things faster. They're talking about cutting out some of the red tape, some of the bureaucracy. And if all that occurs, that would be great for Superfund sites. I won't lie, I'm a little concerned that, that requires a lot of funding, that requires a lot of staffing, and it doesn't seem to me like that is the approach that this administration is taking. But I'm going to keep an open mind and wait and see. There's certainly a lot going on all at once from the Trump administration at the moment. Some of it helpful, a lot of it not so helpful to this industry.
Mm-hmm. Okay. David, this has been great. I'd like to give my audience some takeaways. Where can they learn more about brownfield investment and specific opportunities?
Well, I want to give a quick shout out to a group that I started last year with the help of NIOP and a few other industry organizations. It's called Circulate New Jersey. You can visit our website, circulatenj.com. You'll find a list of examples on that website of sites that have been remediated by myself and a lot of my peers within the industry, that will give you examples of kind of how this process works in a little bit more detail, as well as some of these locations that have been reactivated due to the work of my peers. So I think that's a great place to start. And Circulate really is it's a coalition of kind of logistics industry members that is working to try and improve the perception of the industry to the public. There's been a lot of misinformation as this industry has grown over the last 10 years, and a lot of public pushback to distribution, trucking, logistics in general. But, as Brownfields is a small part of the good that we do for New Jersey, for the whole country's economy, and we've tried to highlight Brownfields on our website. You'll be seeing us put out some additional content over the next couple months as well, kind of highlighting some of these projects in a little bit more detail. So that's a great place to start to learn about some of what the industry's done. In terms of identifying new sites, just look around. They're all around you. Almost everything that we've looked at over the last 2 years has some level of contamination involved. And we look at, I think over the last 2 years, we've probably underwritten and looked at about 100, 120 projects. I'd say 90, 95 of them probably had some level of contamination or remediation. So if you're active in real estate, if you're active in industrial real estate in particular in New Jersey, you are going to find plenty of brownfields. They are not too hard to unearth here. If you're in other markets, again, often you'll find really, really prime dirt that has some issues with it. So I encourage people outside of New Jersey, you look at Google Maps, look at the places around the historic industries of the area, and look for vacancy, look for vacant land. There's a good chance that has some history and some environmental contamination that can be solved. And that's a function of time and money and expertise, right? So if you think that you can take on that risk, I encourage you to look at these historic infill sites that have some historic industry and figure out if, the values today, the expense today, the techniques we have today can justify unlocking those sites. There's a lot across the country. It's not just historic places like New Jersey. Remember, like I said, a lot of the environmental regulations kind of came into place in the 70s and 80s across the United States. And we had a lot of industry across the United States before that, and a lot of very dirty industry as well. So there's still a ton of opportunity out there if you're willing to, no pun intended, get your hands a little bit dirty.
Okay. All right, David, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is a good conversation.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me on Sustainability Street. If you have any questions about this episode or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to me at therese.fitzgerald@cpe-mhn.com. Bye for now.